right in front of my face. All right, well, everybody, see, welcome. So today I thought I would kind of do a brief sort of overview of the history of the company and its profound effect on not only just American culture, but sort of worldwide culture, and kind of how appropriate today that sort of our meeting is kind of centered in two cities, since I'm right here outside of Nashville, Tennessee, and the museum is up in Richmond, Indiana, because those are the two cities that really sort of make this story begin when a sort of group of families in Nashville, which lived on sort of the same street, decided to sort of get married, I guess, to the daughters of John Lumsden, and then get into the piano retailing business in the sort of late 1800s, and how sort of quickly they realized that one of their best-selling product lines was coming from Richmond, Indiana, the Starr piano, which was originally Chase piano and then bought and sort of developed and grew by two sort of prominent local citizens, the brothers Starr. And the Nashville piano concern essentially purchased or partnered with Richmond, Indiana Starr Piano, and decided to build that brand into sort of a national powerhouse, really one of the best pianos available in the United States. And back then, the piano was sort of the centerpiece of the middle class and upper class American household, as that was the primary form of entertainment. So John Lumsden and his son-in-law Henry Gennett partnered with the Starr brothers in Starr Piano, and as they started to grow the company, the buildings down in the gorge met with a couple of calamities, including flood and a devastating fire, I think around 1906. At the time, the citizens of Richmond were very concerned about what these outsiders would do, because by the turn of the century, both Starr brothers, I think, had passed away, as did Mr. Lumsden, and the company was now owned by Henry Gennett, and they were headquartered in St. Louis, Missouri. No, John Lumsden was still alive at this time. And the citizens were very concerned about, whether this company, now that was not really all local, was going to rebuild. And John Lumsden replied, there was no use crying over spilled milk. And he sent Henry Gennett and his family to Richmond, Indiana, to oversee sort of the rebuild and expansion of the Starr piano factories. And so the Gennetts moved into Richmond, Indiana from St. Louis, and Henry Gennett, as you see there in the center, with his wife Alice, with their three sons, Henry, Clarence, and Fred, and their daughter Rose, moved to Richmond, and eventually both built that mansion up on Main Street. The piano company was doing really, really well. However, right around the beginnings of World War I, sort of in the teens, a dynamic change began to happen in the entertainment business, and the piano was slowly being replaced by the phonograph as the centerpiece of most middle and upper class, and also with working class homes, as it was much more affordable than a piano, and also didn't require anyone to know how to play it. All you need to do is crank it up and put a record on. So the Starr piano officers, which at this time was Henry Gennett and his three sons, met on June 12th. By the way, that's a Saturday, so they were working 6-7 days a week in 1915, and amended their charter to expand the product line from not only pianos, and by that time they're probably doing player pianos, but into all devices that create and reproduce sound. So they were going to move into the phonograph business. And by about 1915, the phonograph, pretty much all the patents were in the public domain, so you could build that. And so The Starr Piano Company was well equipped. They had the factory capabilities. They had craftsmen and tradesmen, all with the ability to transform or to add a new product line, the phonograph, which is what they did in 1950. And by the way, this document, which I consider one of the most important documents, is at the Wayne County Historical Museum. And so they decided in about 1916, they began putting out records under the Starr label. And soon after that, they decided to change the name of the label from Starr to Gennett. And there's a lot of reasons why they did that. They had a permanent studio facility in New York City, which was the center, the capital of the recording industry. All the major record companies were there, and the new independents were sort of headquartered there. But they did something very, I think, groundbreaking, which is they decided to open a permanent recording facility on their sort of campus, I guess is the way you can look at it, and to record there. So they had two full-time studios, one in sort of New York City, and then one that they retrofitted into an old lumber, I think it was a kiln, right there on a railroad spur. Not ideal locations for a place where you're concerned about controlling sound, to be next to a spur, and then also to have the line running up on top of the ridge. But this was a way for them to be able to record more and release more product into the marketplace. So in 1921, they opened a studio and began recording things. The interesting thing about sort of Gennett was that they really did not develop a traditional record company sort of business model, in that the way in which they staffed that company was very different than how the other labels were staffed, even the independent labels. For the most part, there would be sort of the company, whether it was Victor or Columbia or Paramount or OK Records. And then there would be a group of professionals who were sort of what we would call music men. Again, it was a male-dominated industry, or male sort of only industry at that time. And these were people who scouted music talent, who were aware of, the trends in music, and who was doing what. The Gennetts never did this. Pretty much everyone that worked for the company was hired in sort of as a piano employee, and then eventually would be moved into, hey, you can be the sound engineer, and hey, while you're running the store up in Chicago, let us know what's going on up there. So it's very interesting, sort of that how not by design, what they did really profoundly affected American music and really changed American music. So in 1921, they opened the studio in Richmond, Indiana. And one of the first things that they ran into was that, just like all the other new companies that were putting out music product, was that they couldn't compete with the major companies, the Victors and the Columbias, who were putting out predominantly sort of cultural uplift music, like opera and European dance, classical music, sort of theater music, Broadway music, and maybe some sort of middle brow music, like light dance music, but nothing really kind of American in nature. All that music was to be traced back to sort of European roots and sort of European sort of sensibilities. And nothing really kind of American, particularly music made by African Americans or working class whites, was being recorded, or any kind of ethnic groups. So once they kind of figured out that, hey, we can't compete in sort of that marketplace, we need to develop our own marketplaces. And one of the first ones they hit upon was one that was at the time, or would soon be called, Race Records, which was music created largely by African Americans, or had a lot of African American roots to it. And in some cases, the audience for that was largely African American, because by this point, phonographs were cheap enough that working class and blue collar workers and farmers could afford a phonograph in their home. And it's really interesting how they revolutionized American music very much by accident. And it sort of has to do with sort of this coming together of so many events into this sort of one moment where the right decision was made. You know, you had all of these largely African American, but also white musicians leaving New Orleans around 1917, when the Navy shuts down Storyville, and also part of that great migration north as blacks were looking to get away from the Jim Crow laws into more sort of the industrial opportunities that existed in the north. And Gennett, having piano stores all over the U.S. to retail their music product lines, pianos, phonographs, and records, and sort of a relationship that developed between sort of their store manager Fred Wiggins and a local music publisher, the Melrose Brothers, and all these musicians were coming up from New Orleans and settling in Chicago, and they were packing out these clubs. And Fred Wiggins and the Melrose Brothers, doing good A&R, sort of said, if those people are coming out to see these artists and there's lines around the block, then it's safe for us to also believe that they would also buy records. And so they began to sort of sign and record these artists. The three most notable were the New Orleans Rhythm Kings, which is the band on the lower right, Jelly Roll Morton, who's sort of center there, and then of course King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band, featuring a young trumpet player by the name of Louis Armstrong. This music was dynamically different than the jazz that was being marketed and released at between 1917 and these 1923 recordings. The music that American public heard in that sort of 6-year period was largely, while it was jazz, it lacked kind of the improvisational characteristics, the syncopation, the improvisation that is so fundamental and foundational to jazz music. It tended to mirror more theater music or dance music. And these three artists were coming out of sort of that New Orleans tradition of, you know, heavily syncopated, improvisational music. So these recordings, you know, these artists were sent down to Richmond to record in 1922 with the New Orleans Rhythm Kings, and 23 for Morton and King Oliver. And I guess first we should just sort of take a step and acknowledge that it was 100 years ago this month that the King Oliver recordings were created in Richmond, Indiana. And that those recordings kind of alone were a catalyst for the explosion of American music, whether it was big band or it was swing or eventually bebop, but also jump blues, which becomes rock and roll. When people heard what King Oliver and Louis Armstrong were doing on record, you know, then that inspired the next generation artists that eventually came to Gennett, like Bix Beiderbecke, who's sort of center bottom there, Hoagie Carmichael, who's on the left, and Duke Ellington. Once they heard Louis Armstrong and King Oliver records, that got them excited, because this was new music, this was young music, this was vibrant music. This was sort of music of their generation, and they wanted to be a part of that. And so those records are sort of are profoundly important to American popular music. I mean, we really trace so much of what, I mean, you could trace every artist that's out today, you know, it's sort of a 6 degrees of separation to those King Oliver recordings. And it's not to say that, I do want to point out, it's not to say that there weren't other artists doing that. Kid Ory, for example, or there's a couple of other sort of Louisiana artists that, you know, predated them that were doing that music, but they weren't being recorded, right? So unless you were in New Orleans or you happened to be in the city or on the riverboat they were playing, you would never hear it. But now, because Gennett could, you know, record, press, and distribute thousands of copies throughout the United States and also into Canada, could anybody pretty much hear it, you know, for 85 cents or $1, whatever the charge was. So that was groundbreaking, sort of right there. The next group of artists that also recorded there that are again foundation to not only American popular music, but just modern music across the world, were the blues artists. Gennett in and of itself isn't sort of the big preeminent blues label. Gennett's prominently more known for the jazz and for the next genre we'll talk about. Blues was predominantly successful or released on a more consistent basis on Paramount Records and OK Records. But in addition to releasing some pretty good blues records, including the first sort of Mississippi Delta blues record, records by William Harris, which sort of predates Charlie Patton and Robert Johnson. They also had a good lineup of blues artists. But in addition to that, many of those sort of, I guess, more critically acclaimed, or the ones that we sort of cite more as profoundly having an effect on popular music, were recorded in the studio. They were Paramount signed artists, but they recorded in the Gennett studios, including Charlie Patton. Charlie Patton's first records are recorded in Richmond, Indiana's studio for Paramount. And Charlie Patton sort of is the godfather of rock and roll, which finally they acknowledged last year and inducted him into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. His music influenced, first Robert Johnson, and then Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf, B.B. King, all who were sort of from that area of Mississippi, and took what they heard with Charlie Patton and the showmanship that Charlie Patton had, and took that sort of to the sort of next levels, which are sort of the urban blues, the electric blues, and then eventually rock and roll. Gennett recorded the first ones with Patton and then the last ones with Blind Lemon Jefferson. Lemon Jefferson really was the first. Well, actually, let me correct that. He's the second really sort of acoustic blues artist, or what we would sort of consider the sort of prototypical blues sound, 12-bar blues, 3 chords, and the truth. Gennett actually recorded an acoustic blues artist before that, Daddy Stovepipe, and that's a picture of him lower center there in front of the recording horn. That's actually him in the Gennett studios in Richmond, Indiana. So blues artists, and again, the blues artist is a direct lineage to rock and R&B and soul and funk and hip hop. It's the foundation for all sort of music today. And then probably the area that I think that Gennett doesn't really sort of celebrate enough of its place in its history, or people don't acknowledge, but it's the country music. They really were if not, I argue they were the first, but they are amongst the first labels to record this style of music, which now is a multi-billion-dollar a year industry, and it's the sort of epicenter of everything that happens down here in Nashville, is the country music sort of infrastructure. But Gennett was amongst the first to record this style of music with the William Hutchins records, and I could talk about those. Those are really interesting in and of themselves. But a couple of the biggest country artists of the time and eventually of the genre, first Bradley Kincaid. And again, not many people really know about how big of an artist this Bradley Kincaid was. But back then, radio stations were the sort of the epicenter of American entertainment, and there were several radio stations that could broadcast almost nationwide from their one sort of tower. WSM in Chicago was one of them. WLS in Chicago was one of them. WSM down in Nashville, of course, being the other one. And the most popular shows that both these radio stations put on were these barn dance variety shows, which were country music and country sort of comedy. And a lot of the artists that appeared on those early barn dance shows became national celebrities. Bradley Kincaid was the biggest star on WSM's National Barn Dance. And eventually another fellow that first recorded for Gennett, Gene Autry. And really that's where he developed his sort of cowboy persona that is now every country artist sort of carries that with them, the cowboy hat, the big buckle and stuff like that. But and then Uncle Dave Macon there also was the first star of the Grand Ole Opry on WSM. There was a book put out several years ago, and it's a great book put together by Tony Russell. It's a discography of all the country recordings made before 1942, so pre-World War II, which is the era of Gennett. And if you go through that book, you really can't turn more than 5 pages without landing on a series of Gennett entries. I mean, there really is no other label that sort of had that much product out there by so many artists and what have you. And really, can't really even sort of put a barometer on how important Gennett's label was for preserving the sound of sort of country music, or back then it was called hillbilly music, and then how that sort of fueled the next generation, right? Planted the seeds for the Roy Acuffs and the Hank Williams, and eventually, the Johnny Cashes and Merle Haggards and Maren Morrises of the world, really all stem from these early Gennett recordings, largely made in Richmond. And so that kind of brings me to the sort of the second part of that. One was to kind of give you an overview, but then to sort of really drill down into the label's most prolific recording group, and to sort of and to listen to some of those recordings. In 2004, there's a photo there, bottom right, taken. That's me on the far right of that picture. I'm standing next to Malcolm Rockwell. He and I were there meeting to begin work on compiling a discography of all the Gennett records. So that's kind of the big thing in sort of the record collecting world and record sort of academia, is sort of discographies, knowing everything that was recorded, trying to get as much information about each recording, try to put it into some kind of usable sort of list, and to be as completist as possible, using a variety of different information. So there we are, sort of meeting for the first time, and there are two sort of legendary Starr Gennett Foundation folks there on the left, Elizabeth Searles and the late great Al Gentry, who really, in addition to his work on preserving sort of the Gennett history in Richmond, Indiana, really was a productive citizen for the city, and overseeing kind of the creation of a lot of green space and a lot of sort of historic preservation in your city. And we're talking about doing a discography. And I always kind of laugh at the date there on the bottom of 2004, because I'm happy to report in 2023 that it's finally coming out. It's only taken us about 18, 19 years. It'll be coming out free of charge on the UCSB, University of California at Santa Barbara's discography of American Historical Recordings project. So look for announcements of that coming out. But Malcolm and I worked really well together for several years, despite being thousands of miles apart, me in Tennessee and him in Hawaii. Worked on this project and took different tacks at it. And the thing about the discography that always sort of caught my attention wasn't the big artists, right? So the artists I mentioned earlier, like King Oliver and Louis Armstrong, all that information was kind of already out there and sort of known and sort of easy to compile. But as we started getting into the layers of what Gennett was recording, as we sort of looked at the recording logs, I really got excited by this program that they had called Personal Recordings, where not only could you be signed to Gennett and then they would press your record and market it and distribute it, and you'd earn a royalty on it, but you could go down to the Gorge with a couple of dollars in your pocket, and they would let you, and you would sort of rent out the recording facility. You could record what you wanted to record, and then you could press as many copies of it that you could then, give to your friends and family And it led to some very interesting records and some early records by some known artists. But also it'd be fascinating as you ran down sort of what was happening that day or that week in Richmond. And it would be like Gene Autry was here and he did like 8 recordings. And then the next day it was, fiddling Doc Roberts and he did a couple of recordings. And then the next day it'd be like this, just 1 or 2 recordings made by somebody, and it had no release information or it was personal. And so you always wondered who was that person who went down there and recorded. So a lot of that was going on, in addition to them, the traditional sort of route. And so I sort of dug in and was sort of looking at, well, who were these people that came in there? And what I found was actually the most prolific group that were recording personal records were actually the Gennetts themselves. They recorded records, records back then and still records today have sort of 2 primary functions. One is to sort of entertain, and I guess in a way you could say inspire or develop aspirations. But the other one was education. That was a sort of a big thing about the phonograph back then. In addition to entertaining, was also about educating the sort of American public. But the Gennetts actually used their recording facilities and their ability to press records for communication. So it's very interesting, and I'm going to drill down into some of this. But essentially, all the Gennetts made records for one reason or another, and for different reasons. Now, I show this picture of sort of the Gennett sort of I don't know if to call these executives but these are the folks that worked in the administration building. And the administration building was supposedly a very beautiful building with a wonderful staircase that unfortunately got torn down. It would have been across the street from the logo building that still stands. So when you sort of are looking at the logo building, you look towards the Whitewater River. I think kind of where the parking lot is would have been where the administration building is. But I like this picture for a couple of reasons. One is just it's great to see all the people that were working there. 2, not all these people have been identified, and one of the people that Rick Kennedy and I, Rick Kennedy especially, I call it Rick Kennedy's white whale, is that we've yet to find a picture of Fred Wiggins, right, the fellow up in Chicago who we would consider the person who signed Jelly Roll Morton and King Oliver and New Orleans Rhythm Kings, but developed that Chicago pipeline from the WLS, the country artist. But we don't have a picture of him. Never seen a picture of him. And so I'm always convinced whenever I see these group pictures that Fred Wiggins is one of those gentlemen in there. But the other thing I love about it is that when you do sort of long-term sort of studies or histories of people that have before you've even gotten to them, they have long since passed, is that as you start to develop sort of their history, you kind of in your mind have what their personality was like. How did they operate? How did they go through daily lives? And Fred Gennett is such an important figure in the history of the recording industry. And so you always sort of wonder, what was he like as a person, as an executive, as a family man in his day-to-day life. And I always think this picture just illustrates to me how I picture Fred Gennett. So the bottom row here, from left to right, so I'm kind of doing it from where everyone's looking. The bottom row there, left is Clarence Gennett. Then to the right of Clarence is their father, Henry Gennett. To Henry Gennett's right is Harry Gennett, and to Harry Gennett's right is Fred Gennett. So you have the 3 Gennett sons and father on the bottom row. And then kind of take a look at what's going on in the picture. 2 things seem to be going on. It seems to be that half of the people are doing what you normally do when someone's taking your picture, which is they're looking at the camera. So those are the people looking straight ahead at us. It appears to me something is going on the right, because a lot of people are looking off to the right. So somebody's doing something over there on the right. Maybe a train's coming in on the spur. I don't know what it is when this picture was taken. But then look at Fred. He's looking complete. He's like, he's sit down, he's slumped down, he's got his hat in his hand, he's ready to leave. He's got other things, more important things to do than sit here take a picture, something else is on his mind. So when I sort of started to notice that the Gennetts all recorded stuff, which were largely personal recordings, I wanted to go out and sort of recompile all these records and try to find them, which is a very difficult task, especially since these were probably pressed in very few quantities at best. And I wanted to sort of recompile this sort of family audio photo album, because a lot of what I was seeing that they were doing with this was communicating with each other or communicating, with their friends and their family. And thankfully, a lot of the Gennett family had some of these recordings. We found one or two of them in archives. But basically everyone in the family, we can actually hear their voice now, except for Henry Gennett, because he passed on in 22. And I never really saw him in the list in the discography. So that's what I'm going to kind of do first, is just sort of play these recordings that we found. I'll play a little bit of each. If anyone wants to hear more of it, I'd be glad to go back to them. But Alice Gennett, this was the matriarch of the family, Henry Gennett's wife, the mother of Clarence, Harry, Fred, and Rose. And after Henry Gennett passed away, she actually took a very active role on the board of directors for Starr Piano and Gennett Records, and then eventually when they moved out to California. And in 1922, she is one of the first people to record. And the Gennetts put out a series of records called Christmas Greetings. And the Christmas Greetings records were largely Hollywood actresses and poets, and William Jennings Bryan would give a sort of personal Christmas greeting on one side, and then on the reverse side, they would have some sort of Christmas music. And so Alice Gennett's records were not intended for the public. This essentially was her Christmas greeting card that she mailed out to, I guess, her friends and family to communicate her Christmas wishes to them. So here's a little bit of Mrs. Gennett's Christmas greetings. And let me know if you cannot hear this.
Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. The same old greeting, but not in the same old way, because this year has brought to us a new style of holiday greeting, and I feel quite up to date when I send to you in my own voice my very best wishes for a Christmas full of love, joy, and happiness. And as the old year rings out and the path of the new year opens before us, it is as a sealed book, each day a page, each month a chapter, and when the last chapter is finished, may the history written thereon be as your heart desires. Again, I wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Alice L. Gennett.
Love that little signature at the end, Alice L. Gennett. Alice and Henry's oldest son, Harry, eventually became the head of the Starr Piano Company upon the death of his father. And he primarily led the piano division through the 20s and 30s. In addition to running that, he recorded a couple of things down in Starr Valley. And actually what we're going to listen to, I believe, predates the recording studio. They probably were using some portable equipment or testing out the equipment. But he recorded a sort of Christmas present for his son, Harry Jr. Harry Jr. Will sort of develop and run the sound effects division into one of the largest sound effects companies of the 30s and 40s, which supplied sound effects for radio and for television and motion pictures. And so you can kind of hear in this recording, this Christmas present for him, you can hear how maybe he was influenced to get into the sound effect game. In addition, he recorded under a pseudonym with his friend Norman Brown. He played cello or violin. It's really not that good. I have that recording, but I generally don't tend to play that. Which actually I found quite by accident on eBay one time. It was just a test pressing, and I was wondering who this was, Harmon the Great was, and doing some sleuthing and some inspecting, found out that the har part of Harmon was Harry Gennett, and the mun part was Norman Brown, and that will do it. But anyway, we're going to listen to this little Christmas present that Harry made for his son. And again, I believe this predates the recording studio in Richmond. In Richmond, it was recorded on the grounds. But anyway, so you can hear a little bit of this.
Well, this is Christmas, and Sandy has been to our friend Harry Gennett and left one of Henry Ford's brand new 1918 pin bands. So Harry decides he will take a spin. So here it goes. As the machine has no electric starter, he will have to crank it. Now we're all going 10 miles an hour in Henry. 50 miles an hour in Henry. After 100 miles, everything.
And I just need to kind of point out, when you listen to these, this is all cut live. So there's no overdubbing. So in order for Harry to do that, he has to have those sound effects next to him to either play or queued up if he's going to be playing from a recording. So, and again, this was just done as a sort of present for his son. No intention to release it worldwide. But actually, one of the Gennett sons did make records for the general populace, and that was Clarence Gennett, the middle son, who became the company's treasurer. From what I understand, he's really not as involved in the company as maybe Harry and Fred are. He's sort of more of what I guess you could say, sort of an aristocrat. He helps to build the theater in Richmond, and was very involved in yachting in Nantucket. So much so that as sort of the, I guess, second or third in charge of the Nantucket Yacht Club, he sent out an appeal to all the members of the yacht club to buy into this thing called the Rainbow Fleet. He wanted, actually, I'll kind of show you here what the Rainbow Fleet looks like. That's actually there on the right, a postcard of the Rainbow Fleet. So the Nantucket Yacht Club every sort of year would just sort of have a convoy of sailboats that would go around. And he developed this idea that each one should have a different colored sail. And so here he was trying to pitch all the membership to go out and buy their own sailboat, from this manufacturer, so that they could put on this sort of Rainbow Fleet kind of water parade. And so instead of sending a letter or a cable, he sent all the members a record with his appeal. So you can kind of hear that.
The Rainbow Fleet should sail this summer, 16 strong. The Nantucket Boat Works will build for us 4 or more rainbow boats, just like the present one, at $475 each. Delivery in May or June. We ask you, as a member of the Nantucket Yacht Club, to help us make the racing at the club a feature of the summer at Nantucket. This appeal to our members from our Vice Commodore to buy a boat is made in the spirit of Nantucket, and each member is requested to join our fleet with the rainbow sails and race with us on the afternoons of Independence Day, Labor Day, and each Saturday during the season. Do it now, like the Vice Commodore, Clarence, Gennett, 102 South 18th Street, Richmond, Indiana.
I just love the title there, Vice Commodore. So that was just aimed at the membership of the Nantucket Yacht Club. But he also released records under a pseudonym called Charles Gordon. And so how do we know if it's a pseudonym or not? A lot of times in the recording ledger or on one of the recording cards, it will actually have the person's real name on it. So we know, say, vocals by Clarence Gennett. It's just that they're on the record, they'll give him another name. So this Gennett was notorious for sort of doing that. But he actually released commercial records. These are fairy tales, sort of poems. I can't see why anyone would have purchased these. I don't really see any notation that these are great sellers, but here's just a little bit of that one.
Lucy Lockett lost the copy. City figure found it. There was not a penny in it, but a living round it. Jack and Jill went up the hill to catch a trail of water. Jack turned down and Brooke found, and Jill came tumbling after.
I see these more as like elocution lessons than really something you would play for your child to entertain them. But my favorite of all the Gennett family recording artists, or at least that is until the end, because the last one is my favorite, but is Fred Gennett. He actually recorded quite a bit. Fred, the youngest son, became the company's secretary, but more importantly was the head of the recording division. So he basically is in charge of the record division, Gennett Records. Harry's in charge of the piano division, and Clarence is just kind of the treasurer, making sure that they stay in business. So Fred Gennett is the one kind of approving all these recordings being made. And again, he's not a music man in sort of this traditional sense of things. I mean, at other companies, they had people like John Hammond and Art Satterley and Frank Walker and Ralph Peer, who were music people. And, you know, to sort of evidence this even further, when Gennett goes out of business, you know, Fred does not try to get back into the record business. He and Harry try to get back into the piano business, and eventually they get into the freezer business, travel business, hardware business. They never think about going back to the record business after Gennett fails during the Depression. Whereas all those other people I mentioned, when their company failed or they got fired, they looked for another job somewhere else. They made their careers in music. This was just a sort of entrepreneurial sort of moment in time. So anyway, he recorded actually about at least 10 times. Some of them are kind of sales talks. There's one or two other ones I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. But the only one that we've found to date is probably the one I would want to have found of all of them. This is a sort of an oral record or oral letter sent to Senator James Watson of Indiana. So Senator James Watson, there was a tax, I guess, that was going to be added to the tax code that would have profoundly affected Gennett's tax liability. And so rather than write a letter or go to Indianapolis or Washington to lobby Senator James Watson, Fred Gennett sent him a very terse record about his position on this tax. Senator James Watson, I mean, there's a lot of things you kind of say about him, but you know, this is 1920s Indiana, and so he definitely had or reputed to have Ku Klux Klan membership or ties, and really wasn't sort of a great all-time senator, but nonetheless, that's, you don't necessarily, well, you do pick your senators, but whoever you get, that's who you have to lobby to try to get the laws passed or rules changed into your favor. And this record is actually one of the first records made in the Richmond, Indiana studio in 1921. And it's Fred Gennett to Senator Watson, Equity on Taxation. There's only 2 copies out there. One was a copy that was sent to Senator Watson that's in private hands. And the other one was a copy that Fred Gennett kept and actually put a recording of his son on the back, which we'll hear in a second, that the Gennett family had. So very lucky that they kept that heirloom throughout, and that it didn't break also. So here is his letter. I always say, a little word of caution before, because at the end of this, the way in which you say dollar and piano might fundamentally change. So anyway, here's Fred Gennett, mad about taxes.
Let me apply this by names and figures. The Starr Piano Company is a retailer that both wholesales and manufactures. The Victor Talking Machine Company sells to jobbers only, allowing a varying jobbing discount up to 50 and 10% on some goods. Therefore, if this record were a commercial record, retailing at 85 cents, for each retail sale, the Starr Piano Company would be taxed 4 1/4 cents, while the Victor Company would pay only 1 91 1/4 cents. Again, on a sale of a $100 phonograph, the Starr Piano Company would pay $5, while the Victor Company would pay only $2.25. On player pianos, we will compare with the Kohler industry, who are the largest Eastern manufacturers and who sell to dealers only. The Starr Piano Company would pay on a $550 player piano $27.50, while the Kohler-made instrument would be sold for approximately $275 and would bear a tax of only $13.75. Tell me, Senator Watson, how can we compete? Our trade is intensely competitive. We sell almost exclusively on installment. Our margin of profit has averaged around only 4%, and we have lost heavily this year. Under the conditions proposed by the House, we could dismantle our factory and buy goods from our competitors to be sold at retail and save money. We are told that the only objection to the present clause is that manufacturers who retail only have not been included. Fairness does not justify Congress eliminating this paragraph, but it does require that equality shall be extended to all. Divide the burden equally. Don't penalize any legal form of organization. That is all we ask, and no one living in the spirit of American liberty can deny the justness of our complaint.
Well, I understand that tax law did get changed, so that little oral letter worked. In addition to the 3 sons making records, they also, the children also got into the game. As I mentioned earlier, Harry Gennett Jr., Harry's son, got into or ran the sound effects division. And I remember talking to Linda Gennett Ermshire, who's Harry's daughter, when I was doing this project, how kind of sad I was that we couldn't find a recording made by her father where we could hear his voice, until I kind of read through some old archival paperwork and sort of found that, sometimes the sound effects that Harry was putting out were what we would call fake. And it wasn't actually the animal or the object making the sound, it was Harry making the sound. So going through some of the logs, finding out that a record that was released on the sound effects record to provide different kinds of cat noises, I kind of envisioned Harry and his partner Richard Connors trolling the alleyways of Richmond, Indiana to record, fighting alley cats. And I guess after a while, becoming frustrated with not finding 2 cats fighting or meowing. And maybe, I don't know if they were drinkers, but maybe they had a couple of drinks and decided to kind of, cut the endeavor off early. And so when you listen to this, I think you'll agree that this is not 2 cats fighting or meowing. It's actually Harry Jr. and Richard Connors. Yeah, so I think we all agree that that was not Cats. As I mentioned earlier, that on the back of that Fred Gennett record was a recording called Dickie Speaks or Dickie Bean Soup. And this is Fred's son, Richard, recording in the Gennett studios. Again, he's one of the first people to record in that newly built studio. And Richard went into business with his father after the piano company folded with Gennett & Sons, which put out refrigeration supplies. Hospital ice carts was a big business for them. Houseboats, the Flotel actually is got somewhat of a cult following. These houseboats that were designed by Richard, a hardware and travel agency. So here's a little bit of young Richard recording in 1921.
Woke up in the morning, I looked up on the wall. Looking to when the bed broke and having zero ball. The score was nothing, the team was good. So bad I missed the ball and knocked me out of bed. I went downstairs to my bed first, the bed was hurting still. The coffee tastes like tobacco juice, no couldn't see. I can't get my butt, can't get my butt, can't get my morning. Can't get my butt, can't get my butt, can't get my feet. The purple working sergeant, the sergeant working sergeant, tennis working sergeant, the all.
And then the last recording I'm going to play for you is by Alice Gennett Martin. She's the daughter of Rose Gennett. This is the only daughter of Henry and Alice Gennett. And she recorded in 1927 a Christmas greeting. Again, this was only for family, so there's very few copies out there as opposed to the other Christmas greetings with William Jennings Bryant and a couple of Hollywood actresses. She was 6 years old at the time, and I would argue this is probably the damn cutest thing I've ever heard in my life. So enjoy young Alice Gennett Martin doing Good Morning and a Ladybug song.
Good morning, good morning. Good morning, good morning. The birds all seem to say, good morning, good morning. Oh, come enjoy the birds in song. Good morning, good morning. Be happy all day long. How do you? How do you? Fly away, fly away, fly away. Don't let us go down, sleeping so snow, sleeping so snow, sleeping so snow. Better go home now, you better go home. Better go home right now.
You have to kind of admire her ability to focus because there's a lot of knocking going on. Either someone's walking in the studio or pounding on the walls, and she doesn't miss a beat. So anyway, that's kind of the end of my presentation. Open for questions or anything, but I first want to make sure that all these folks on this slide get thanked because they are the ones who kind of have kept this history or part of this history alive and allowed someone like me to come in and sort of put some pieces together. So anyway, so thanks to all those great folks up on there. And thank you.
Okay, does anyone have any questions before we let Charlie go? Well, thank you so much, Charlie.
Thank you.
And I hope everyone has a wonderful day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Enjoy the beautiful, hopefully it's beautiful weather up there too. Enjoy the day.
Yep, you too. Bye, Charlie.
Bye.